The moment Sage Hunter saw his wife mixing the salad with her wedding ring off, he knew their Tuesday routine had shifted into something else entirely, not removed for washing dishes or kneading dough but deliberately placed on the windowsill like a discarded thought. She hummed while she worked, the same tune she'd been carrying for 3 weeks now, something he didn't recognize from their shared playlist or the radio stations they'd grown comfortable with over 7 years of marriage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena moved around their kitchen with a lightness that should have been beautiful but felt rehearsed instead. She'd started wearing her hair down more often, letting it catch the evening light streaming through their bay window, and tonight she'd chosen the blue dress that used to be reserved for anniversaries or date nights they no longer planned. The fabric whispered against her legs as she reached for the olive oil, and Sage noticed how she'd begun standing differently, shoulders back, chin lifted like she was posing for someone who wasn't him. Their dining room table held the same ceramic plates they'd received as a wedding gift from Elena's grandmother, the ones with tiny painted roses that had survived countless moves and arguments and lazy Sunday brunches. Tonight Elena had set them with more care than usual, napkins folded into perfect triangles, water glasses filled to the same level, silverware aligned with the precision of someone who had time to think about presentation. The overhead light cast everything in warm amber, the kind of atmosphere that usually meant good news or celebration, but Sage felt the familiar weight in his chest that came with recognizing patterns where they didn't belong. Elena had been different since the beginning of March, not dramatically, not in ways that announced themselves with arguments or tears, but in the quiet shifts that accumulate like dust until suddenly you realize how much has settled. She'd started waking up earlier, slipping out of bed before his alarm with the explanation that she wanted to catch the sunrise during her morning runs. When he offered to join her, she'd smile and say the early hour helped her think, that she needed the solitude to prepare for her day at the nonprofit where she managed community outreach programs. The runs themselves weren't new. Elena had always been disciplined about exercise, carving out time 3 mornings a week to maintain the runner's build she'd carried since college. What was new was the way she'd return home glowing with more than exertion, carrying herself like someone who'd discovered a secret that made ordinary mornings feel electric. She'd shower immediately, lingering under the water longer than necessary, emerging with her skin flushed and her hair wrapped in the good towel she usually saved for special occasions. Her phone habits had evolved too, though subtly. Where she used to leave it charging on the kitchen counter while they cooked dinner together, now it traveled with her from room to room, tucked into the back pocket of her jeans or resting face down on whatever surface was needed. She'd developed a way of checking it that looked casual but felt purposeful, fingers moving across the screen with the kind of muscle memory that comes from frequent practice. When notifications arrived, she'd glance at them with an expression Sage couldn't quite name, something between anticipation and satisfaction, before clearing them with quick swipes that left no trace. The changes in their evening routine had been gradual enough that Sage initially attributed them to seasonal adjustment or work stress. Elena had always been social, but now she filled their calendar with obligations that didn't include him. Dinner with her sister became a weekly appointment. Book club meetings stretched later into the evening. She joined a pottery class on Thursday nights, returning home with clay-stained fingernails and stories about glazing techniques that felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced the details during her drive home. Their conversations had developed a strange quality, as if Elena was speaking from a script she'd written in advance. She'd ask about his work at the architectural firm with the same interested tone she'd always used, but her follow-up questions felt perfunctory, boxes to check rather than genuine curiosity about the commercial renovations that had been consuming his attention for months. When he shared frustrations about difficult clients or celebrated small victories with building permits, she'd nod and make appropriate sounds, but her eyes held the distant focus of someone whose mind was running calculations in the background. The physical distance had crept in so gradually that Sage couldn't pinpoint when it had started. Elena still curled against him in their queen-size bed, still kissed him goodbye in the mornings before heading to her office downtown, still laughed at his jokes during their weekend grocery runs. But her touch had acquired a quality that reminded him of politeness, gestures that fulfilled expectations without carrying the unconscious intimacy they'd built over years of shared space and synchronized routines. She'd developed new interests that seemed to emerge from nowhere, fully formed and passionate. Suddenly she was reading novels by authors Sage had never heard her mention, literary fiction with complex narratives about family secrets and second chances. She'd started listening to podcasts about personal growth and mindfulness, philosophical discussions about authenticity and living with intention that would play softly from her earbuds while she folded laundry or organized their closets with newfound enthusiasm. Her wardrobe had undergone subtle updates, nothing dramatic enough to warrant comment but noticeable in aggregate. New lipstick in a deeper shade than she usually preferred, jeans that fit differently, emphasizing curves she'd always had but hadn't seemed interested in highlighting, a perfume that was almost familiar but not quite, something that made Sage turn his head when she passed by, trying to place the scent that had replaced the vanilla and jasmine fragrance she'd worn since their honeymoon. Elena had begun taking phone calls on the back patio, sliding the glass door closed behind her with explanations about not wanting to disturb his evening reading or television shows. Through the window, Sage could see her pacing the length of their wooden deck, gesturing with her free hand in animated conversation with someone who made her throw her head back in laughter he rarely heard anymore when they were alone together. The calls lasted 30 or 40 minutes, sometimes longer, and when she'd return inside, she'd carry the energy from those conversations like a charge that slowly dissipated as she readjusted to the quieter rhythm of their shared evening routines. Their mutual friends had started asking Sage where Elena was at social gatherings she'd begun declining. Birthday parties and barbecues and casual dinners that had once been automatic acceptances now required consultation with a calendar that seemed perpetually full. She'd developed a gracious way of begging off, citing work commitments or family obligations or the need to catch up on rest, explanations that were perfectly reasonable and completely unsatisfying. When Sage attended these events alone, he found himself fielding questions about Elena's absence with answers that felt inadequate even to himself. The morning routines that had once been synchronized had drifted into parallel tracks that rarely intersected. Sage would wake to find coffee already made, Elena's mug rinsed and drying in the dish rack, evidence of a morning that had started without him. She'd leave notes propped against the coffee maker, cheerful reminders about dinner plans or weekend commitments, written in the neat handwriting he'd always admired but now seemed to carry messages he wasn't quite receiving. Elena had started talking about the future differently, in abstract terms that didn't quite include specific references to their shared plans. Where she used to discuss their someday house with the big kitchen and the garden space, now she spoke about personal growth and discovering untapped potential. She'd mention articles she'd read about people who'd completely reinvented their lives, career changes and geographical relocations, and the courage required to pursue authentic happiness.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
These conversations felt like she was testing ideas, floating concepts to see how they landed in the space between them. Her relationship with her own family had intensified in ways that surprised Sage. Elena had always been close with her parents and her younger brother, but now she spoke to her mother almost daily, long conversations that happened behind the closed door of their home office. She'd started visiting her childhood home more frequently, weekend trips that stretched into overnight stays, returning with energy that took days to settle back into their household routines. When Sage offered to join these visits, Elena would explain that her mother was going through a difficult time, that the family needed space to work through some personal issues that were better handled with just immediate relatives present. The nonprofit where Elena worked had apparently become more demanding, requiring evening meetings and weekend planning sessions that hadn't existed during her first 3 years with the organization. She'd been promoted to senior coordinator, a role that came with increased responsibility for grant applications and community partnerships, projects that seemed to generate excitement in her that spilled over into their dinner conversations. She'd described new initiatives and collaborative programs with community leaders, speaking about her work with passion that reminded Sage of how she talked about their relationship during their early dating years. Their physical intimacy had evolved into something that felt choreographed, moments that happened on schedule rather than emerging from spontaneous connection. Elena had always been affectionate, quick to reach for his hand during movies or curl against him while they read in bed on Sunday mornings. Now her gestures felt considerate but calculated, expressions of care that checked boxes rather than responded to impulse or desire. When they made love, she was present but somehow protected, going through motions that satisfied expectations without revealing the kind of vulnerability that had once made their physical connection feel like a private language they developed together. Sage had tried addressing his concerns directly, choosing moments when they were both relaxed and the house felt peaceful. He'd ask if everything was all right, if there was anything she wanted to talk about, if work or family stress was affecting her more than usual. Elena would smile and reassure him that everything was fine, that she was just busy with seasonal projects at work, that sometimes people went through phases of wanting more personal space without it meaning anything significant about their relationship. Her explanations were reasonable and delivered with the kind of patience that made questioning them feel petty or parasites and it the which into biz is due. The financial aspects of their shared life had remained stable, their joint checking account showing the same predictable patterns of mortgage payments and grocery runs and utility bills. But Sage had noticed Elena using her personal credit card more frequently, charges that didn't appear on their shared statements. When he'd mentioned it casually, she'd explained that she was being more intentional about maintaining her individual financial identity, that it was healthy for couples to preserve some separate economic spaces even within marriage. Mortuus hetses as pros versus sisters betrissituale. When he'd mentioned it casually, she'd explained that she was being more intentional about maintaining her individual financial. She wasn't secretive about the purchases, just private, a distinction that felt meaningful but difficult to articulate. Their weekend routines had shifted from shared activities to parallel pursuits that happened to occur in the same house. Elena would spend Saturday mornings at farmers' markets or coffee shops, returning with fresh flowers and artisanal breads that elevated their usual breakfast routine. Sunday afternoons found her organizing closets or deep cleaning rooms with sudden bursts of energy that transformed their living space but left Sage feeling like a witness to renovations he hadn't requested. When he offered to help, she'd smile and say she found the work meditative, that physical activity helped her process thoughts and emotions in ways that conversation couldn't replicate. The social media activity that Elena had never been particularly invested in suddenly became more frequent and curated. Her Instagram account, which had previously featured occasional photos of their travels and holiday celebrations, now showed carefully composed images of sunrises and coffee cups and inspirational quotes about personal growth and authentic living. She developed an eye for photography that seemed to emerge from nowhere, capturing light and shadow in ways that suggested artistic sensibilities Sage hadn't noticed during their years together. Elena had begun talking about her dreams differently, describing sleep filled with vivid narratives that left her feeling energized rather than rested. She'd wake up with stories about flying, or discovering hidden rooms in familiar houses or meeting people who felt like old friends despite being complete strangers. These dreams seemed to provide her with inspiration for the day ahead, creating a sense of possibility that carried her through morning routines with unusual enthusiasm. When Sage shared his own dreams, which were typically mundane or quickly forgotten, Elena would listen politely but without the engaged curiosity she brought to her own subconscious adventures. The way Elena talked about time had shifted subtly but noticeably. Where she used to plan their evenings and weekends with the assumption that they'd spend them together, now she'd present her schedule as a series of individual commitments that he was welcome to join if he was available and interested. Social invitations were extended to both of them, but Elena would often accept or decline on her own behalf without consulting him first, creating a pattern where their social calendar felt less coordinated and more like separate lives that occasionally intersected. Their home, which had always felt like a shared project they were continuously improving, began to show signs of Elena's individual aesthetic preferences. She'd rearrange furniture when he was at work, creating conversational areas and reading nooks that reflected her personal taste more than their combined sensibilities. New plants appeared in corners and on windowsills, greenery that required daily attention and created a sense of life and growth that felt vibrant but somehow separate from the environment they'd previously cultivated together. Elena's relationship with food had evolved in ways that puzzled Sage. She'd always been a good cook, someone who enjoyed trying new recipes and hosting dinner parties for friends. Now she seemed to approach meal preparation with artistic intensity, spending longer at grocery stores selecting ingredients with careful consideration, preparing dishes that were more complex and presentation-focused than their usual weeknight dinner. The act of cooking had become performative, something she did with an audience in mind even when they were eating alone. The music that filled their house had changed gradually, Elena's playlists featuring arts and genres that felt sophisticated but unfamiliar. Jazz standards and indie folk and instrumental pieces that created atmosphere but didn't invite singing along or dancing in the kitchen while they prepared meals together. When Sage would add songs to their shared streaming account, his contributions would disappear for a few days, replaced by Elena's curated selections that reflected tastes he didn't recognize as belonging to the woman he'd married. Their communication patterns had developed subtle but significant changes. Elena had always been someone who processed thoughts out loud, working through decisions and concerns by talking them through with Sage as her sounding board. Now she seemed to arrive at conclusions internally, presenting him with fully formed ideas and plans that left little room for collaborative input or adjustment. When he'd try to engage with the decision-making process, she'd explain that she'd already considered various options and felt confident about her choices, an independence that was admirable but felt exclusionary. The physical spaces Elena occupied in their house had become more defined and personal. Her side of their shared closet had been reorganized with new storage solutions and careful arrangement of clothing by color and season. The bathroom counter showed evidence of new skincare routines and beauty products that suggested more time and attention being devoted to personal grooming. These changes were subtle improvements that made practical sense but collectively created an impression of someone preparing for occasions or audiences that didn't include him. Elena's energy levels seemed to follow patterns that didn't correspond to their shared schedule. She'd be tired and ready for bed early on nights when they were home alone, but energetic and talkative after her various evening commitments with friends or family or work colleagues. The contrast was striking enough that Sage began to wonder if their quiet evenings together had become draining rather than restful for her, if the comfort they'd always found in each other's company had somehow transformed into obligation or routine. Now, as Sage watched Elena put the finishing touches on their Tuesday dinner, arranging everything with care that felt both loving and distant, he realized that the accumulation of small changes had created a fundamental shift in the atmosphere of their marriage. The woman moving gracefully around their kitchen was undeniably his wife, someone he knew intimately and loved deeply, but she was also someone who seemed to be living a parallel life that rarely intersected with the one they'd built together. Elena turned from the counter with a smile that was warm but somehow prepared, like she'd been practicing in the mirror. She held a bottle of wine they'd been saving for a special occasion, something Sage had forgotten they owned, and she opened it with movements that suggested she'd been planning this dinner as an event rather than their usual Tuesday routine. She poured 2 glasses with equal measures, handed him one with a touch that lingered just long enough to feel intentional, and settled into her chair across from him with the posture of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. The candle she'd lit cast flickering shadows across her face, and in that warm light Sage could see both the woman he'd married and someone else entirely, someone who'd been making decisions and building plans that didn't include him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Elena raised her wineglass toward him with deliberate slowness, the crystal catching the candlelight and throwing tiny rainbows across the white tablecloth she'd spread over their usual wooden surface. Her smile held steady as she took a sip, watching him over the rim with eyes that seemed to be measuring his reaction to something he hadn't yet understood. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, filled with the weight of words she was preparing to speak and the sense that their Tuesday evening had transformed into something that required courage from both of them. Sage had learned to read Elena's emotional weather over 7 years of marriage, recognizing the subtle shifts in her posture and expression that preceded important conversations. Tonight she carried herself with the careful composure of someone who had rehearsed difficult words until they felt manageable, practiced in the mirror until her delivery could remain steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. She set her wineglass down with precision, aligning it perfectly with the edge of her napkin, and folded her hands in her lap with the kind of stillness that comes from forcing nervous energy into submission. The meal she'd prepared sat between them like a peace offering or perhaps a Last Supper, dishes that represented more effort and intention than their typical weeknight routine warranted. Sage recognized the pattern now, understanding that elaborate dinners had become Elena's way of softening ground before difficult conversations, creating an atmosphere of care and consideration that would make harsh truths feel less brutal. She'd done the same thing before telling him about her father's cancer diagnosis, before announcing her decision to leave her first job for the nonprofit position, before revealing that her brother's marriage was ending in a custody battle that would require family support and financial assistance. Elena reached across the table and touched his hand, her fingers cool from holding the wineglass, her wedding ring catching the light as it pressed against his skin. The contact felt both familiar and foreign, carrying the memory of thousands of similar gestures while somehow communicating that this touch might be different, more significant, possibly final. She looked directly into his eyes with the kind of sustained eye contact that people use when they need to ensure their message is received and understood completely. The words came quietly, almost conversationally, as if she were discussing weekend plans or grocery lists rather than dismantling their shared life. She needed to tell him something important, something she should have mentioned weeks ago but hadn't found the courage or the right moment to bring into the light. Her voice carried the carefully modulated tone of someone who had practiced this speech until it could be delivered without breaking, each syllable measured and controlled to prevent the conversation from spiraling into emotion before the facts had been presented. Elena explained that she'd been struggling with feelings and situations that were complicated, that didn't fit into the framework of their marriage in ways that were easy to explain or justify. She'd found herself in circumstances that had developed gradually and then suddenly, relationships that had started as friendships and evolved into something more significant without her initially recognizing the transformation. Her honesty was brutal in its precision, delivered with the kind of clinical accuracy that doctors use when explaining diagnoses that will change everything about how patients understand their bodies and their futures. She'd met someone through her work at the nonprofit, a collaboration that had begun professionally and gradually become personal in ways that caught her off guard. Dr. Marcus Webb was a pediatric psychologist who consulted with their organization on childhood trauma programs, someone whose expertise and passion for helping vulnerable children had impressed Elena during their initial meetings about grant applications and community outreach strategies. Their working relationship had evolved into coffee meetings that stretched longer than necessary, phone conversations that continued past business hours, and a connection that had surprised them both with its intensity and emotional depth. The revelation came with careful explanations about timing and intention, Elena's need to make clear that she hadn't planned for this to happen, that she'd fought against her growing feelings for months before acknowledging them even to herself. She described the internal conflict that had been consuming her energy and attention, the guilt and confusion that had made her withdraw from their marriage while she tried to understand what was happening in her heart and what it meant for their future together. Her words painted a picture of someone who had been drowning in secret emotions, struggling to maintain the appearance of normalcy while her inner life underwent seismic shifts that changed everything about how she saw herself and what she wanted from her remaining years. Marcus had been divorced for 3 years, Elena continued, was raising a 12-year-old daughter named Sophie with joint custody arrangements that required careful coordination with his ex-wife. He lived in a renovated craftsman house 15 minutes from Elena's office, a space he'd decorated with his daughter's artwork and photographs from hiking trips they took together on weekends when she stayed with him. Elena's voice took on a different quality when she described his home, warmer and more animated, as if she were talking about a place where she'd found comfort and belonging that had been missing from her daily life. The relationship had remained emotional rather than physical, Elena was careful to clarify, though she admitted the distinction felt meaningless when her heart had already made commitments that her body had yet to follow. They'd shared long conversations about their respective marriages, both acknowledging that they'd grown apart from their spouses in ways that felt irreversible. Marcus had described his divorce as necessary but amicable, a recognition that he and his ex-wife had become excellent co-parents but incompatible partners, people who loved each other enough to admit that their marriage had run its natural course. Elena's descriptions of Marcus revealed details that Sage realized she'd been collecting and treasuring, small observations that people only notice when they're falling in love. She knew that he drank his coffee black but ate his toast with honey, that he'd trained for a marathon before his daughter was born but hadn't run competitively since becoming a father, that he played guitar but only when Sophie wasn't around because she teased him about his singing voice. These intimate details felt like inventory from a relationship that had progressed far beyond casual friendship, evidence of attention and care that Elena hadn't been directing toward her own marriage. The timeline Elena provided made clear that her emotional withdrawal from Sage had coincided with her growing attachment to Marcus, though she presented this as coincidence rather than causation. She'd begun spending more time on work projects that involved his consultation, staying late at the office for meetings that could have happened during regular business hours, finding reasons to collaborate on initiatives that stretched beyond their original scope. What had started as professional admiration had evolved into personal attraction, then emotional intimacy, then the kind of connection that made her question everything she'd believed about her own marriage and what she wanted from her future. Marcus had been honest about his interest in pursuing a relationship with Elena, though he'd also been clear that he wouldn't pressure her to leave her marriage or make decisions based on their connection. He'd told her that she needed to evaluate her relationship with Sage independently to determine whether her marriage was fulfilling and sustainable regardless of whether she chose to explore possibilities with him. His respect for her existing commitments and his refusal to be the reason she ended her marriage had made Elena's feelings for him even stronger, proof of character that contrasted with the guilt and secrecy that had been poisoning her daily life. The conversations Elena and Marcus shared had covered topics that she and Sage rarely explored anymore, discussions about personal growth and authentic living and the courage required to build a life that reflected individual truth rather than social expectations. Marcus had shared books and articles about people who'd completely restructured their lives in middle age, stories of individuals who'd found the strength to leave comfortable but unfulfilling situations in pursuit of genuine happiness. These ideas had taken root in Elena's thinking, creating a framework for understanding her dissatisfaction with her marriage not as temporary discontent but as a signal that she needed to make fundamental changes. Elena paused in her explanation to refill their wine glasses, the domestic gesture creating a moment of normalcy in the midst of revelations that were destroying the foundation of everything Sage had believed about their relationship. She moved with the same grace she'd always possessed, but now he could see that her comfort in their shared space had been maintained through performance rather than genuine belonging. The woman who had been setting their table and cooking their meals and sleeping beside him had been living a double life, not through deception but through the kind of emotional compartmentalization that people use when they can't face the full magnitude of changes they need to make. The financial implications of Elena's revelation began to dawn on Sage as she continued talking, though money was clearly the least important aspect of what she was revealing. Their joint savings account, their shared mortgage, the car payments and insurance premiums and retirement contributions they'd structured around the assumption of a permanent partnership suddenly looked like complicated knots that would require careful untangling. Elena had clearly been thinking about these practical considerations, though she presented them as secondary to the emotional truth she needed to acknowledge about her feelings for Marcus and her growing certainty that her marriage to Sage had become a comfortable arrangement rather than a passionate partnership. Elena's description of Marcus's daughter Sophie revealed another layer of complexity that she'd been contemplating in private. Sophie was apparently artistic and thoughtful, someone who'd adjusted well to her parents' divorce and had developed close relationships with both her mother and father despite the changed family structure. Marcus had shared stories about Sophie's resilience and creativity, her ability to find joy and stability despite the disruption in her family life, evidence that children could thrive even when parents made difficult decisions about restructuring their relationships. Elena's interest in Sophie's well-being suggested that she'd been imagining herself as part of a different kind of family configuration, one that involved step-parenting responsibilities and the emotional complexity of loving someone else's child. The revelation that Elena had been discussing their marriage problems with Marcus felt like a particularly sharp betrayal to Sage, though she presented it as inevitable given the emotional intimacy they'd developed. She'd shared her frustrations about feeling disconnected from him, her sense that their relationship had become routine and predictable in ways that left her feeling invisible and taken for granted. Marcus had listened without judgment, offering perspective from his own experience of recognizing when a marriage had stopped growing and started merely existing. His insights had helped Elena articulate feelings she'd been struggling to understand, giving her language for the dissatisfaction that had been accumulating like sediment in her daily life. Elena's new morning running routine suddenly made sense as Sage realized that she'd been meeting Marcus for early workouts, their shared exercise creating opportunities for conversation and connection that didn't require deception about their whereabouts or activities. The sunrise runs she'd described as solitary meditation had actually been intimate conversations with someone who was helping her process the changes she was contemplating. The energy and glow she'd carried home from these sessions hadn't come from physical exercise but from emotional connection with someone who saw her as fascinating and desirable in ways that had apparently been missing from her marriage. The pottery class Elena had joined on Thursday evenings existed, but it also provided cover for dinner dates with Marcus that had become increasingly frequent and emotionally significant. She'd been careful to attend enough actual classes to maintain the credibility of her story, but the majority of her Thursday evenings had been spent in restaurants and coffee shops with someone who listened to her thoughts and dreams with the kind of attention that made her feel alive and valued. The clay-stained fingernails and stories about glazing techniques had been props in a performance designed to maintain the illusion that she was simply expanding her creative interests rather than developing a relationship that was displacing her marriage. Elena's increased contact with her family suddenly revealed another dimension as she explained that her mother had been providing emotional support during this difficult period, helping her process her feelings about both her marriage and her attraction to Marcus. Her mother had apparently been encouraging Elena to prioritize her own happiness and authenticity, sharing stories from her own life about opportunities she'd missed because she'd been too concerned with maintaining appearances and meeting other people's expectations. The weekend visits Elena had been making to her childhood home had included long conversations about the courage required to make major life changes and the regret that comes from staying in situations that no longer serve personal growth. The professional demands Elena had attributed to her promotion at the nonprofit were real, but they'd been intensified by her collaboration with Marcus on projects that weren't strictly necessary but created legitimate reasons for them to spend extended time together. Their work on childhood trauma programs had been genuinely successful and beneficial for the community, but it had also provided a framework for developing personal intimacy under the guise of professional partnership. Elena's passion for her job had been authentic, but it had been amplified by her excitement about working closely with someone who challenged and inspired her in ways that extended far beyond grant applications and community outreach strategies. Elena's new interest in literature and podcasts about personal growth had been inspired by Marcus's recommendations, books and programs he'd found helpful during his own divorce and the process of rebuilding his life as a single father. The quotes about authentic living that had appeared on Elena's social media accounts were reflections of conversations they'd shared about the importance of living according to personal truth rather than social expectations. Her sudden enthusiasm for philosophical discussions about relationships and personal development had been fueled by someone who engaged with these topics as central to creating a meaningful life rather than abstract concepts to consider during idle moments. The changes in Elena's physical presentation, the new clothes and makeup and attention to her appearance had been motivated by her desire to look attractive for Marcus during their meetings and dates. The deeper lipstick and better-fitting jeans weren't about general self-improvement but about catching the attention of someone whose opinion had become more important than her husband's. The new perfume that Sage had found almost familiar was something Marcus had complimented during one of their early coffee meetings, a scent Elena had adopted because it reminded her of their developing connection and the possibility of becoming someone different than the woman she'd been during her marriage. Elena's revelations continued with details about the future she'd been imagining with Marcus, conversations they'd had about the possibility of building a life together that included his daughter Sophie and the kind of partnership that prioritized emotional intimacy and shared growth rather than comfortable routine. They'd discussed practical considerations like where they might live and how they'd blend their families and careers, though Elena was careful to present these conversations as hypothetical rather than definitive plans. The fact that such detailed discussions had occurred revealed how seriously she'd been considering leaving her marriage and how thoroughly she'd been planning a different kind of future. Marcus had apparently been patient and respectful throughout Elena's process of self-discovery, never pressuring her to make immediate decisions or leave her marriage before she was certain about what she wanted. His approach had been to support her emotional journey while maintaining clear boundaries about their physical relationship, understanding that she needed space to evaluate her marriage honestly before moving forward with him. This restraint had made Elena's feelings for him even stronger, providing evidence of the kind of emotional maturity and consideration she felt had been missing from her relationship with Sage. The evening phone calls Elena had been taking on their back patio were daily conversations with Marcus, discussions that covered everything from their respective work challenges to their hopes for personal happiness and fulfillment. These calls had become the highlight of Elena's days, providing emotional sustenance and intellectual stimulation that made her realize how much had been missing from her marriage. The animated conversations Sage had witnessed through their window were Elena at her most authentic and engaged, talking with someone who found her fascinating and desirable in ways that reminded her of who she'd been before marriage had settled into comfortable routine. Elena's financial decisions to use her personal credit card more frequently had been motivated by her desire to pay for her own meals during dates with Marcus, maintaining a sense of independence and equality that felt important as she navigated the complicated emotions of developing a relationship while still married to someone else. The charges Sage hadn't seen on their joint statements included dinners and coffee meetings and small gifts Elena had purchased for Sophie, efforts to build a connection with the child who might become her stepdaughter if she decided to leave her marriage and pursue a future with Marcus. As Elena's revelations continued, Sage began to understand that every change he'd noticed in her behavior and routine had been connected to this secret relationship that had been developing parallel to their marriage. The woman sitting across from him had been living a double life, not through deliberate deception but through emotional necessity, unable to face the magnitude of the changes she was contemplating while simultaneously unable to stop herself from pursuing connection with someone who made her feel alive and valued in ways she'd forgotten were possible. Sage set his wine glass down with deliberate control, the crystal touching the wooden table with barely a sound despite the storm building in his chest. Elena's words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that had been burning undetected for months, finally visible but already having consumed more than could be salvaged. Her confession about Marcus and Sophie and the life she'd been imagining without him had the quality of a verdict being read, final and irreversible, despite being delivered in the gentle tone she used when explaining difficult concepts to the children in her nonprofit programs. The silence stretched between them as Sage processed the full scope of what Elena had revealed, understanding now that every strange detail he'd noticed had been connected to this parallel relationship that had been growing in the spaces she'd carved out away from their marriage. Her morning runs with Marcus, her Thursday evening pottery class cover stories, her increased family visits that had provided emotional support for her decision to leave him, her new clothes and perfume chosen to attract someone else's attention. The woman sitting across from him had been auditioning for a different life while maintaining the performance of their marriage, and the realization hit him with the force of recognizing that he'd been living with a stranger who wore his wife's face. Elena watched him carefully as he absorbed her revelations, her expression mixing hope and apprehension, as if she expected him to respond with understanding or perhaps gratitude for her honesty. She presented her emotional affair as a journey of self-discovery rather than a betrayal, framing her attraction to Marcus as evidence that she'd outgrown their marriage rather than evidence that she'd violated their commitment. Her careful explanations about maintaining physical boundaries seemed designed to minimize the damage, as if emotional infidelity somehow carried less weight than physical infidelity. As if sharing dreams and intimate conversations with another man while withdrawing from her husband was a forgivable offense that could be managed through proper communication and mutual understanding. Sage found his voice after what felt like hours but had probably been less than a minute, his words coming out steady and quiet despite the chaos in his mind. He asked Elena if she loved Marcus, a simple question that cut through all her careful explanations about personal growth and authentic living to reach the core truth she'd been dancing around. Her answer came without hesitation, a soft yes that carried more certainty than anything she'd said to him in months. The admission landed between them like a door slamming shut, final and unambiguous in ways that made all her other explanations feel like elaborate justification for a decision she'd already made. The practical questions began to flow from Sage's mind as the emotional reality settled into place. He asked about their mortgage, their joint savings account, their shared car insurance, their retirement contributions, all the financial entanglements that would need to be unwound when their marriage dissolved. Elena had clearly been thinking about these logistics, producing a folder from the kitchen counter that contained printed documents and handwritten notes about asset division and legal procedures. Her preparation was thorough and considerate, evidence that she'd been planning this conversation and its aftermath for weeks, possibly months, while he'd been obliviously maintaining their routine and assuming their problems were temporary adjustments rather than fundamental incompatibilities. Elena's proposal for handling their separation was presented with the same careful organization she brought to her work projects, a detailed plan that addressed everything from who would keep their house to how they'd handle their wedding gifts and shared belongings. She'd researched divorce mediation services and gathered information about uncontested divorce procedures that would minimize conflict and legal expenses. Her thoroughness was impressive and devastating, proof that she'd been mentally divorcing him long before tonight's confession, working through practical considerations while he'd been trying to understand why she seemed distant and distracted. The revelation that Elena had already discussed their marriage problems with her family created another layer of humiliation for Sage, understanding that her parents and brother had been watching him at family gatherings while knowing that Elena was planning to leave him. Their recent interactions suddenly made sense, the careful way her mother had been treating him, the slightly formal tone her father had adopted during their last few conversations. Elena's family had been providing emotional support for her decision while maintaining the pretense of normal in-law relationships, leaving Sage as the only person who didn't understand what was happening in his own marriage. Elena's description of her future plans revealed how completely she'd mentally moved on from their relationship. She'd already spoken to her supervisor about the possibility of taking a leave of absence to focus on personal matters, creating space in her professional life for the transition she was planning. She'd researched apartments in Marcus's neighborhood and had tentative conversations with realtors about what their house might sell for in the current market. Her level of preparation suggested that tonight's conversation wasn't the beginning of her decision-making process, but the formal announcement of conclusions she'd reached weeks ago. The discussion of Elena's relationship with Sophie felt particularly painful to Sage as he realized that she'd been building connections with another man's child while gradually withdrawing from their own life together. Her descriptions of Sophie's artwork and school achievements carried the affection of someone who'd already begun thinking of herself as a potential stepmother, emotionally investing in a family configuration that excluded him entirely. The ease with which Elena talked about loving someone else's child made her emotional distance from him feel even more deliberate and final. Sage asked Elena when she planned to leave, a question that seemed to surprise her despite all her careful preparation. She'd apparently assumed that their conversation would lead to mutual agreement about separating gradually, perhaps maintaining their living arrangement while they worked through the legal and financial aspects of divorce. Her suggestion that they could remain friends and support each other through the transition felt surreal to Sage, as if she genuinely believed that discovering her emotional affair and her plans to build a life with someone else would somehow bring them closer together rather than destroy whatever trust and affection had survived her months of deception. The anger that Sage had been suppressing throughout Elena's confession finally began to surface, not explosive or dramatic but cold and focused like a surgical instrument cutting through the pretense that had been suffocating their marriage. He told Elena that she could leave immediately that evening rather than extending the charade of their relationship while she finalized plans with Marcus. His suggestion seemed to shock her, as if she'd expected him to be grateful for her honesty and willing to participate in whatever timeline she'd constructed for their separation. Elena's response revealed how completely she'd misunderstood the impact of her revelations, suggesting that Sage was being hasty and emotional rather than considering the practical benefits of a gradual separation that would minimize disruption to both their lives. Her tone carried the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a confused child, apparently unable to grasp that her husband might not be interested in facilitating her transition to a new relationship or maintaining friendship with someone who'd been planning to abandon their marriage for months while pretending everything was normal. The conversation that followed was brief and decisive, lacking the drama that Elena seemed to have been expecting. Sage told her that she could pack whatever she needed that evening and arrange to collect the rest of her belongings later, preferably when he wasn't home. His matter-of-fact tone seemed to disturb her more than shouting would have, evidence that she'd been prepared for emotional confrontation but not for practical dismissal. The reality that her confession had consequences beyond hurt feelings appeared to be settling in as she realized that her carefully planned timeline was being accelerated by his refusal to participate in extended divorce negotiations. Elena made one final attempt to salvage some version of the gradual separation she'd been envisioning, suggesting that they could benefit from couples counseling or mediation to work through their issues more constructively. Sage's response was immediate and final, explaining that counseling was designed to help couples who wanted to stay married, not to manage the logistics of dissolution for someone who'd already chosen a different partner. His clarity seemed to deflate her remaining arguments, leaving her with no choice but to accept that their marriage was ending that night rather than according to whatever schedule she'd preferred. The practical arrangements were handled with the same efficiency Elena had brought to her confession, dividing immediate necessities and establishing a timeline for her to collect the remainder of her belongings. Sage offered to stay elsewhere while she packed, but Elena declined, gathering her essentials with quiet dignity while he waited in the living room they'd shared for 7 years. The domesticity of her packing, the familiar sounds of drawers opening and clothes being folded, created a surreal soundtrack for the end of their marriage. Elena paused in the doorway before leaving, offering a final apology that seemed more about her own guilt than genuine remorse for the damage she'd caused. Sage's response was brief and neutral, acknowledging her words without accepting or rejecting them, understanding that forgiveness was irrelevant when trust had been so thoroughly destroyed. She left their house keys on the kitchen counter beside the folder of divorce planning documents, a symbolic gesture that felt both appropriate and inadequate for the magnitude of what was ending. The months that followed were a masterclass in efficient dissolution, Elena's thorough preparation making their divorce proceedings remarkably smooth despite the emotional devastation underlying the practical arrangements. Sage learned to navigate the strange loneliness of a house that had been designed for 2 people, gradually reclaiming spaces that had been shaped by Elena's preferences and routines. The silence that had once felt oppressive became peaceful, free from the tension of living with someone who was mentally and emotionally invested elsewhere. Elena married Marcus 8 months after their divorce was finalized, a small ceremony that Sage learned about through mutual friends rather than direct communication. The wedding photos that circulated on social media showed Elena radiant and relaxed in ways he hadn't seen during the final year of their marriage, confirmation that her decision to leave had been the right choice for her happiness, even if the method had been devastating for him. Sophie served as junior bridesmaid, looking comfortable and happy in her new family configuration, evidence that Elena's instincts about their compatibility had been accurate. Sage eventually began dating again, approaching new relationships with hard-earned wisdom about the importance of attention and emotional presence that he'd taken for granted during his marriage. The experience of being gradually abandoned by someone who continued to share his bed and his daily routines had taught him to recognize the early signs of disconnection and to address problems directly rather than hoping they would resolve naturally over time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.